Some houses have histories that stretch far beyond their walls, stories that outlive the people who once called them home. But what if those stories were never meant to be uncovered? What if, behind every locked door, lies something far more sinister than anyone could imagine? This house is no ordinary home. It's infamous for its sealed doors, bolted from the inside with no explanation, no reason, and no key. When the new residents tried to force their way in, they thought it was just a mystery to solve. Little did they know, they were about to awaken something dark. Something that had been waiting for them all along. Now, they've stepped into a place where reality twists and bends, where the past bleeds into the present in ways that can't be explained. What happens when you tamper with things that were never meant to be touched? The new inhabitants are about to find out, but by then, it might be too late. As they pry open the doors, they're not just unlocking rooms. They're unlocking nightmares, buried deep in the foundations of the house. And once the secrets of this place are revealed, there's no going back. It all started with the doors. When the new owners moved into the old house, they couldn't ignore the heavy, ancient wooden doors scattered throughout. These weren't your typical doors. Each was locked tight, sealed from the inside with no visible keyholes. At first, they brushed it off, thinking they'd eventually find a way to open them. But as the days passed, the doors became more than just an odd feature. They felt like a warning, something meant to be left undisturbed. One evening, curiosity got the better of them. They tried everything, tools, force, even calling a locksmith. But the doors refused to budge. It was almost as if they were protecting something, as if the house itself was alive, aware of their intentions. The air grew heavier each time they approached one, a thick tension filling the space as if they were stepping into a forbidden area. And then came the first noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping from behind one of the doors, almost like someone was waiting. The longer they stayed in the house, the stranger things became. What once seemed like a harmless old structure started to feel more like a prison. The doors, once silent and still, now seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if something on the other side was calling to them. They began to hear faint whispers late at night, too quiet to make out the words but clear enough to send chills down their spines. They tried to ignore it, but the doors loomed larger in their minds, dominating every corner of their thoughts. One night, the father of the family had a dream, or at least that's what he told himself. In the dream, he stood in front of one of the doors, its wood warped and creaking as if alive. A voice, low and guttural, urged him to open it, promising him knowledge, power, something he couldn't quite understand. He woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, but the pull of the doors was stronger now, almost irresistible. That morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind those doors was aware of them too. The more they tried to resist, the more the house pushed back. Doors would rattle softly in the middle of the night, as though something was testing the boundaries, checking if they were ready to give in. The children began to complain of cold drafts and the feeling of being watched, but no matter how much they tried to explain it away, the truth lingered in the back of their minds. The house and whatever was behind those doors was not normal, and soon it would demand their attention. As the nights grew colder, the sounds started to intensify. At first, it was just faint creaking, the kind of noises you could easily dismiss as the house settling. But as the hours stretched into the dead of night, the noises became unmistakable footsteps, dragging slowly across the wooden floors, always stopping just before the locked doors. No one wanted to admit it, but they all heard it. It wasn't just a figment of their imaginations. It was something real, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. There was one night when the mother, Sarah, awoke to the sound of soft knocking. It was a deliberate knock, almost polite, but persistent. She held her breath, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway where one of the locked doors stood. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m., the same time every night when the noises started. She lay still, not daring to move, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks. But the knocking continued, growing louder, more urgent, until it suddenly stopped. The family tried to brush it off, convincing themselves it was nothing more than old pipes or the wind playing tricks on them. But deep down, they knew better. Every night, the sounds grew more aggressive. Scratching, tapping, and sometimes even whispers so faint they felt more like thoughts than actual sounds. The children, terrified, began refusing to sleep alone. They spoke of voices calling them, begging them to come closer to the doors to listen. But what disturbed them most was that the voices didn't sound like strangers. They sounded familiar. One evening, as the father, John, stayed up late to work in his study, the noises returned. This time, they were different, closer, more deliberate. He could hear something dragging across the floor, slow and heavy, like furniture being moved. His heart raced as the sound drew nearer, stopping just outside his door. He stared at the handle, watching as it shook slightly, as though something on the other side was testing it, waiting for permission to enter. For a moment, he thought he could hear breathing, slow, steady, and far too close. By the time the clock struck 3:15 a.m. again, the house was no longer quiet. The noises echoed through every room, filling the air with a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Whatever was in the house wasn't just an echo of the past. It was present, aware, and growing bolder by the day. And no matter how much they tried to block it out, they couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that the sounds were leading them somewhere, to the doors and whatever was waiting behind them. As the days went by, the family began to dig deeper into the house's history, hoping to uncover some explanation for the strange occurrences. They found old, crumbling documents tucked away in the attic, letters, newspaper clippings, and journals that spoke of the previous owners. Each piece of paper hinted at something dark, something that no one wanted to talk about openly. There were mentions of disappearances, strange rituals, and whispers of a curse tied to the very land the house was built on. The more they read, the more they realized that the house had never been a home, but rather a prison for something far worse. It wasn't long before they found a journal belonging to a man named William Crane, who had lived in the house over a century ago. His entries began innocently enough, describing his love for the house and the peace it brought him. But as the pages went on, his tone shifted, becoming more frantic. He wrote of hearing voices at night, of doors slamming on their own, and of an overwhelming sense of dread that followed him everywhere. The final entry was the most disturbing. It simply read, "The doors must remain locked, no matter what." After that, his story ended. No more entries, no mention of what happened to him or his family. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and fear, they continued their search. They uncovered an old, forgotten room hidden behind one of the walls in the basement. Inside, they found relics of another time. Dust-covered furniture, tattered curtains, and a large iron chest sitting in the corner. Its lock had long since rusted away, and with shaking hands, they opened it. What they found inside would change everything. Letters, covered in symbols they didn't understand, lay on top of ancient books filled with dark incantations. It was clear now. The house wasn't just haunted by spirits of the past. It was a gateway to something much darker. With the discovery of these old secrets came a terrible realization. The house wasn't just a passive vessel for strange occurrences. It was alive, feeding off the fear and curiosity of its inhabitants. Every strange noise, every cold draft, had been a part of its plan to lure them deeper into its history, to make them uncover what should have stayed buried. The more they learned, the more they understood that the house wanted them there, not as guests, but as part of its story. They were becoming the next chapter in a tale that had been written long before they arrived. Yet, even with this knowledge, they couldn't stop. The pull of the house was too strong. There were more questions than answers, more doors left unopened, more secrets waiting to be revealed. And so, despite the growing fear, they pressed on, knowing full well that whatever they found next might be the one thing they could never unsee. But by then, they were too deep to turn back. The first time they saw the shadow, it was almost too quick to register. A flicker in the corner of their eye, something that moved just out of sight. They tried to convince themselves it was nothing, a trick of the light, a reflection. But deep down, they knew better. The shadow was different from the other strange happenings in the house. It was more than just a noise or a cold breeze. It felt alive, sentient, It wasn't long before they began to notice it more often, always in the hallway, always watching. The children were the first to speak up. They described it as a tall, dark figure that stood at the end of the hallway, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. It didn't move, it didn't speak. It just watched. They were too scared to walk past it, so they'd run down the hall with their eyes squeezed shut, hoping it wouldn't follow. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being watched never left them. It was as if the shadow was growing bolder, feeding off their fear. One evening, as Sarah went to check on the children, she saw it for herself. It stood at the end of the hallway, a figure darker than the shadows around it, its form barely human. For a moment, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. Without thinking, she reached for the light switch, flooding the hallway with brightness. The shadow was gone, but the air still felt thick with its presence, as though it had never really left. John, too, began to notice the shadow's presence. It would appear in the hallway, standing just outside the corner of his vision. He would blink, and it would be gone, leaving behind only a sense of dread. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt it. Something standing at the foot of the bed, watching him. He didn't open his eyes. He couldn't. But he could feel it, could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. His heart raced, but he stayed still, praying it would leave. And eventually it did. But the shadow wasn't done with them. It began to appear more frequently, always in the hallway, always just out of reach. They couldn't ignore it anymore. It was as if the house was showing them something, revealing a piece of itself through the figure in the shadows. What terrified them the most was not knowing what it wanted, or how long it had been there, watching. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, even though they knew the shadow was leading them deeper into something they might never escape. The whispers started softly, barely audible at first. They came in the dead of night, seeping through the walls like a faint breeze. No one could make out the words, but they were there, persistent and unsettling. It was as if the house itself was speaking to them, calling out from somewhere beyond the locked doors. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, echoing down the hallways, floating through the rooms, always just out of reach. The family tried to ignore them, but how could they? The whispers were growing louder, more insistent with each passing night. The children were the first to complain, saying the voices called their names. They said it in hushed tones, afraid of what might happen if they acknowledged the whispers too openly. The voices were soft, gentle even, as if they were trying to comfort them, lure them closer to the locked doors. Sarah and John dismissed it as nightmares, but they both knew something wasn't right. There was something in the house, something that wanted to be heard. And the more they ignored it, the more relentless the whispers became. One night, John decided to investigate. He stayed up late, listening carefully, trying to track the source of the whispers. As the clock struck 3:15 a.m., the familiar time when all strange things seemed to occur, he heard it. His name, spoken softly from behind one of the locked doors. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. He leaned closer, pressing his ear to the cold wood. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but still the words were just beyond comprehension. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized that whatever was on the other side wasn't human. Sarah, too, began to hear the voices. They would wake her in the middle of the night, pulling her from sleep with their eerie cadence. Sometimes, she thought she could hear her own voice among them, as if some version of herself was trapped behind the doors, calling out for help. It made no sense, but in a house like this, sense no longer mattered. The whispers were more than just sounds. They were a presence, a force that seemed to grow stronger the longer they stayed in the house. It wasn't just about the locked doors anymore. It was about the very fabric of reality unraveling around them. The whispers weren't asking anymore, they were demanding. Louder, clearer, they filled the house, invading every corner of their minds. And yet, no matter how hard they tried to decipher the words, they couldn't. It was as if the voices were speaking in a language they were never meant to understand. But one thing was clear. The whispers were leading them somewhere, pushing them towards something that had been waiting for them all along. They were being drawn deeper into the mystery, and there was no turning back now. As the days went on, the family began to feel a presence in the house. A force they couldn't see but could feel in every room they entered. It was more than just a sense of being watched. It was as if something was there with them, lurking just out of sight. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy that made their skin prickle. Even during the day, when sunlight poured through the windows, the house felt darker, as if the light couldn't quite reach the corners where the unseen force hid. It started small, with objects moving on their own. A glass sliding across the table, a door slowly closing when no one was near it. At first, they tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the wind or their imagination. But as the days passed, the force became more aggressive. Sarah would leave a room, only to return and find everything out of place. Chairs overturned, picture frames crooked. John noticed it too, finding his tools scattered when he knew he had left them neatly arranged. The force wasn't just toying with them. It was sending a message. The most terrifying encounters happened when they couldn't see what was happening but could feel it. Late at night, they'd hear the soft rustle of movement, feel a cold breeze brush against their skin, or sense the weight of something standing behind them. But whenever they turned around, there was nothing. The unseen force was always there, just beyond their reach, but always making its presence known. It was a constant reminder that they were no longer alone in the house. One evening, as John sat in his study, he felt the temperature drop suddenly. His breath became visible in the cold air, and the lights flickered. Then, without warning, he felt a hand on his shoulder, a firm, icy grip that sent a shock of fear through him. He spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The force wasn't just a passive presence anymore. It was interacting with them, touching them, making itself known in ways that couldn't be ignored. The more they tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Doors would slam shut without warning, objects would fly across the room, and they began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the force was closing in on them, tightening its grip. They were no longer just guests in the house. They were prisoners, held captive by something they couldn't see or fight. And whatever it was growing stronger, feeding off their fear, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. The house had been building to this moment. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper had led them here. It was no longer a question of if something would happen, but when. The family could feel it, a growing tension in the air, like a storm about to break. They could no longer deny what was coming. They had been drawn into the house's trap, and now there was no escape. The doors that had once stayed locked now seemed to beckon them closer, daring them to finally open what should never have been disturbed. That night, as the clock struck 3:15 a.m., the house came alive. The lights flickered, the walls groaned, and a deep, guttural sound reverberated through the halls. The doors, sealed for so long, began to creak, their heavy with splintering as if something on the other side was pushing against them. John, Sarah, and the children huddled together, their eyes fixed on the doors, knowing that whatever had been waiting was finally coming for them. The air was thick with fear, and the unseen force that had plagued them for weeks now felt impossibly close. It was Sarah who made the first move. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, she stepped toward one of the doors, hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the house seemed to shift, the very walls vibrating with a low hum. The door slowly creaked open, revealing a darkness so complete it felt like a void. A cold gust of wind rushed out, and with it, a figure, tall, shadowy, and formless, emerged from the darkness. It was the same figure they had seen in the hallway, but now it was fully there, no longer hiding. John tried to pull her back, but it was too late. The figure moved toward them, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something ancient, something far older than the house itself. The force they had felt for so long was now standing before them, its intentions finally clear. It wanted them. It had been waiting for them, feeding off their fear, their curiosity, drawing them deeper into its grasp. There was no escape, The house had claimed them as its own. The final confrontation came not with screams or violence, but with a quiet, suffocating dread. The family stood frozen, powerless as the figure loomed over them, its shadow stretching across the room. And then, in an instant, the doors slammed shut, locking them inside with the unknown. The last sound they heard was the soft click of the locks, sealing their fate as part of the house's dark legacy. Whatever had been waiting for them had finally taken what it wanted. And now the house was silent once more. What do you think happened to the family? Was there ever a chance for them to escape, or were they doomed the moment they set foot inside the house? The mysteries of this place seem endless, and yet we've only scratched the surface. Could the whispers, the shadows, and the unseen force have been something more? Something that's still out there, waiting for its next victim? Tell me in the comments what you believe lies behind the doors of that house. Have you ever experienced something similar, where the unknown was just a little too close for comfort? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you'll never miss another chilling tale. Who knows what other horrors we'll uncover next? Your suggestions might just inspire the next terrifying chapter. So leave your thoughts below and let me know what kind of stories you want to hear. Until next time, sleep with one eye open.